would like to go to the core of this event and introduce the panel, How Will Silicon Valley Reinvent Itself Post-Pandemic? Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Marc Frangos, a Global Innovation Executive and INSEAD Fellow, who has been instrumental in supporting many of our initiatives already. Marc, over to you.
Thank you, Isabel. Thanks, everyone. And welcome again. I mean, I guess I'm very, very happy to be here as a fellow, you heard, but also as an alum. I'm not going to tell you which year I was at Fontainebleau, because the picture, the group picture at the end, I think is in black and white nearly. So suffice to say that I really enjoyed my time at Fontainebleau. I've been here in Silicon Valley for the last 20 years. This is a reasonable amount of time to be able to talk about the subject of today. Which is the fact that we're now going through a crisis, and Silicon Valley hopefully will reinvent itself. And what we're going to discuss is how it will reinvent itself. Now, I've participated already in two major crises: the tech bubble burst in 2001, 2002, and then the great financial crisis. Every time Silicon Valley came out stronger than it was. So there's a big question as to whether this is going to be the case this time again or not, and that's what we're going to be discussing with our panel. So I'm not going to introduce in detail our panelists. Suffice to say, we have three very different people on the panel. We have Gioia Deucher from swissnex, we have Sean Randolph from the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, and we have Gopi Rangan. Some of you know Gopi. I think he's been mentioned a couple of times already. So they have very different perspectives on our subject of today. So before I ask them to just say a word about who they are really, because I think it's better coming from them, we'd like to have your opinion about this subject, and we'd like to show you a bit of a poll here that we'd like you to click on one of two answers. And really the subject of the matter is, how do you believe this is going to happen post-pandemic? So hopefully we can get the poll coming, and while you answer the poll, and you'll be able to click your response and they will close, we'll ask Gioia, then Sean, then Gopi to introduce themselves. So Gioia, do you mind starting?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, INSEAD, for having me here. I'm Gioia Deucher. I'm the CEO of swissnex San Francisco, part of a global network. We're the official innovation outposts of the Silicon Valley, of Switzerland, across the world, actually. And we inspire the next generation of innovators to create futures in which our planet and societies thrive.
Thank you, Gioia. So, Sean?
Thanks, Marc. Good evening, everybody. I'm Sean Randolph. I'm the Senior Director at the Bay Area Council's Economic Institute. The Council is the major business organization in this part of the world, 75 years old, about 350 companies. I basically run the think tank. Our job is to look at the future of the economy here, maybe medium term, 3 to 5 years and beyond. And ask where it's going and why, and what we can do to address both the opportunities and the issues. So I work a lot on technology, global business in particular, and on how Silicon Valley connects to the rest of the world.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sean. And Gopi?
Hello, everyone. I'm Gopi Rangan. I'm the founding partner of Sure Ventures. Sure Ventures is a Silicon Valley-based venture capital firm. I invest in startups that enable peace of mind. Those are the kind of startups I invest in. I also teach at INSEAD a couple of MBA classes. One of the one that Isabel mentioned is building businesses in Silicon Valley. More recently, I'm a podcast host. My podcast is called The Sure Shot Entrepreneur.
Great, great. All right, thank you. So we have a great panel assembled. We're going to start with questions. But before that, we'd like to read out what you guys answered to this poll. So what is the result of the poll at the beginning? Oh, right. Okay. Well, I'm kind of reassured that you guys still believe that Silicon Valley will be here and strong. So 73% of you said that Silicon Valley will reinvent itself once again and retain its status as the #1 innovation cluster in the world. And still 27% of you think that Silicon Valley will somehow lose some of its influence and dominance, and the dominance might be diminished going forward, potentially fade away. So we're going to get in the thick of it and discuss it. And let me help you frame a little, because we're going to have, this is such a rich discussion about Silicon Valley, and we have so many things to say. We've clustered it in 4 segments, right? The first part is, what about this exodus of these large companies and corporates and even VCs that we've heard about in the news nearly for the last 6 months, nearly one a day, of these companies deciding that actually they're going to emigrate out to Texas or to Florida. So we're going to start with that discussion in a minute. But secondly, after that, we're going to jump onto a subsequent subject, which is what about the tech workers themselves? Because that also we've heard that they are fleeing out of San Francisco, and some of them are getting to the other end of the country, others going to the Caribbean and working on the beach. How is that going to work in the future? The future of work in this hybrid remote working, what is going to be the impact of that on Silicon Valley? So that will be the second sub-subject, if you like. The third piece is the global innovation scene, because you know, as I know, and this is not new, that there are a lot of Silicon Valley wannabes out there on the planet. So, you know, whether it's Silicon Beach in LA, Silicon Desert in Arizona, even in London, where I worked a lot, I worked for a BT for a long number of years, we had a Silicon roundabout in London. So none of these guys have really emerged as a serious competitor to Silicon Valley in the past. Is that going to change? Are we going to see a real reversal of fortune here? And that's our third subject. And finally, we'll finish with the spirit of Silicon Valley. You know what I'm talking about. I mean, this, you know, doing things fast, failing fast. I mean, this beautiful, innovative practice that we have been teaching the entire world so far. So we'll talk about that near the end of our panel, and we'll try and bring some clarity around, or at least opinions about what's going to happen next. And during the whole session, by the way, we'll have a Q&A near the end, a kind of more formal Q&A. But during the whole session, please type in your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll try and bring in your questions live during the discussion. Okay? So that's for the plan of what we're going to do. So let's start right away with our first subject of the exodus of these companies. And you know, we've heard, you know, who they are, right? I mean, it's been tremendous. It's been, you know, we've been talking about HP Enterprise, we've been talking about Oracle, we've been talking about a number of them. I'd like to start with asking Sean that question, because I'm sure, Sean, you have a clear opinion about this. But from your economic observatory position, what do you think and what do you make of it? What is that going to mean for Silicon Valley going forward?
Well, I'd say first, Jean-Marc, it's a real thing. Something is definitely happening. What the longer term implications are, it's a little bit less clear, or how long it's going to continue is a little bit less clear. But when you see some of these companies shifting out, this has been some time in the making for a couple of reasons. One is that we always have been a very expensive place to be, one of the most expensive in the US. And companies that had lower value activity often ended up putting it someplace else because you could find people there to do it at a lower cost. But the core headquarters operation, the R&D, a lot of the creative side was here in the Valley. We're also a pretty highly regulated state here in California, environmental regulations, a lot of things that have actually spurred creativity in a lot of areas, such as climate and the environment, but there's a cost to that. So by and large, companies have been prepared to pay the cost when there was an importance of clustering. And then COVID came along. And I think COVID was really the catalyst where a lot of companies found that their employees could in fact work remotely. They didn't all have to be concentrated together all the time. And that really gave them sort of internal permission to say, oh, well, maybe I can do something someplace outside of Silicon Valley. So it's a debate whether you would call that an exodus or not, but we're definitely seeing some companies going mostly to escape higher taxes, concern about regulations, but I think primarily to address the cost issues, to allow their employees to work someplace where it's more affordable, they can own a home and work more comfortably that way. But I think all that being said, it's not really clear where this is going to be heading because there are more companies coming in even as others are leaving. That's always been the case in California. It's the case today. And we have an enormous crop of new companies, phenomenal, like most of the IPOs in the United States in the last year were Silicon Valley Bay Area companies. And those companies are growing. And the entrepreneurial pool is still extremely strong. So I think it's an open question where this takes us, but it's something that the business community is certainly watching very carefully.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And do you think that, I mean, there's an affordability question, really, and that's the point I think you're making. Do you think we'll end up having only very high margin companies in Silicon Valley that can sustain the cost of Silicon Valley going forward? It's going to be a land of the rich?
Well, that's been the case for a long time. Manufacturing, a lot of it left the area more than 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. It used to be a big manufacturing center, not so much anymore. You've got a lot of prototype manufacturing, you've got a lot of R&D. And I think even the companies, and there are only a handful, there are not that many yet, but those that have visibly left, they're keeping their engineering here in California. So maybe some of the executive team goes somewhere, some of the back office or the legal headquarters may go someplace else. But I think that a lot of the core activity is going to continue to remain here. And the overlying issue that I think people are concerned about and have been for ever since I've been here, as long as I've been here more than 20 years, has been mostly the cost of housing. Now, actually, to own a house, that's getting more expensive. People are moving out of apartments into bigger homes to get more space. But the cost of apartments is down 25%. So one possible outcome is you take some of the heat out of the housing market and it becomes more affordable. And then you hear anecdotally about people who moved out of the area actually moving back now to take advantage of lower rents. So it goes both ways.
Very good, very good. So, Gioia, on your side, you're not moving to Texas or Florida anytime soon, are you? I mean, swissnex is one of the riches. I think you can afford it.
Yeah, well, not so much a question of affordability. I just want to bring in a more human touch here as well. I mean, I'm a San Franciscan by choice. I love this city. And I think probably most of us in this panel do and choose to be here for many more reasons than maybe some of the ones that the poster reasons, let's say, of, the economic growth, et cetera. There's so much more to this city than those things. And I think I just want to bring in that perspective as well. I can't help but think of Richard Florida's creative class and what it takes for a city or a region to establish itself as a true innovation ecosystem. And three of those elements are talent, tolerance, and technology. And I want to spend a second on the tolerance piece, because this is really about culturally unconventional people. And I think many of those other hubs that are now emerging will actually meet a lot of those criteria, including, strong academic institutions, et cetera. But Silicon Valley and San Francisco has always been this magnet for unconventional people who look for a horizon, seek behind the horizon of where we see, and I think that is something that is so unique and that will keep this incredible city always alive and going and in constant reinvention. And that is my absolute conviction. And I think what's currently happening is a correction that was highly necessary and that will not prevent the new startups and the new creative people and the creative class from continuing to flourish in this city. And I think it was a correction that was much needed.
Very cool, and hopefully we will be exporting some of this non-conventional mindset. I remember walking around the streets of Austin and seeing all these stickers saying, "Help us keep Austin weird." This is a quality for a city now. So, Gopi, what about you? I mean, from your perspective, have you lost many friends? Have they gone to Florida? I mean, are you worried about the M&A prospect of your portfolio companies?
When I teach the class for INSEAD students, usually when they come to Silicon Valley, they spend a week here. Most of them are new to Silicon Valley. They ask the question, so where is Silicon Valley? There's actually no clear boundary on where is Silicon Valley. There's a rough boundary, we know. And then the next question they ask is so where's that building where all these startups pitch to VCs? Can I go to that building? And there's no one building, there's no one place. And then most of them, at the end of the week, they write an essay, their reflection on how their week was in the Silicon Valley. The common theme that I've seen is that it's a state of mind. It can exist anywhere. What they pick up from that week in the Silicon Valley is that how to think like Silicon Valley. And that mindset, whether you live in the Silicon Valley or you go elsewhere, it always stays with you. So that is never going to change. I do see some people leaving Silicon Valley, but like you started with the original narration about how Silicon Valley invented and even led the rest of the world out of recession, out of the dot-com bust, and later in 2008, and now after COVID, I see Silicon Valley playing an even more dominant role in the future.
Very cool. Well, looking forward to that. And keep that thought, because we're going to come back to the spirit of Silicon Valley in a moment. We want to explore that a bit more in some more detail. So let's.
I might throw in, Jean-Marc, one thing, adding to Gopi's, that if you think about a lot of the treatments, therapies related to COVID, a lot of that is coming out of biotech and pharma companies in Silicon Valley. And here we are, we're talking on Zoom, Silicon Valley companies. You're on Microsoft Teams, that's run out of Silicon Valley. The technology that is sort of propelling us through COVID and into the future is predominantly coming out of Silicon Valley.
Good point. Absolutely. So that's the, the headquarters moving out. But what about the people themselves? And what's going to happen with this new mode of working? And this is not something that's so new. I mean, there are companies that have been operating remotely for a long time. Particularly startups. And I'm thinking about the likes of GitLab, where Sid has been very articulate about how he runs his company remotely. But what do you think is going to happen with this new remote or hybrid mode? Gioia, you particularly, you have a special perspective on it. You and I, we don't really have roots here. We're kind of easier to move in and out of Silicon Valley. So how will this new world operate in your perspective, Gioia?
Yeah, I think that's the big $100,000 question, $1 billion question. I think nobody really has the answers quite yet, but I think what's going to happen in the next few months will be setting the new directions. I think many companies, actually, I know that we just this morning, actually, we're actually running our own sort of co-working space living lab, and we talked with our design partners for the space, which is Vitra, a big design firm. And, asking them, what are your other clients doing? How are they looking at the future of their space? Because we haven't reopened yet. So we're thinking, how are we functionally going to rethink what our space is for, what the office is for? And I think they said, everybody's asking the same question. So it's an extremely interesting moment. And I think a lot of the ideas and solutions will come out of here. I think we will think of the workspace as more of a collaboration space. We will think of the workspace of more as a serendipity recreation. So that idea of collision and creative collision, people come together, people collaborate, they work together, but they also meet. So less of workspaces where people do focused work, and the focused work will probably increasingly happen in remotely and from people's homes. Now, that said, we have different types of jobs. Any company has different types of jobs. So you have jobs that can absolutely and could always be done remotely. And other jobs will absolutely need to rebound and come back to actually physically interacting. You think about the creative work, you think about designers, you think about the innovation work that absolutely lives from that interaction of people working together over protracted periods of time and engaging in those very intense physical sprints. So I am absolutely sure that hybrid form will remain, but that the physical collaboration will absolutely re-emerge and also define how our offices, design-wise and furnishing-wise, and will actually be conceived in the future. And we will see lots of changes there. And I'm very curious to see what's going to happen to downtown San Francisco. All those buildings that they were made for desks, right? So how are they going to reinvent themselves and rethink how they use space? I'm quite excited to see that.
Fair enough. Absolutely. And everybody's worried about that serendipity, losing that serendipity. Is that part of the fabric of Silicon Valley? Are people not going to be creative and innovative anymore if they lose that kind of happenstance interaction? So a lot of people are working on recreating that by software, by the way, which is interesting. But for you, Gopi, on the from an investor's perspective here, what does it look like? Are you worried about teams in your portfolio companies being scattered at the four winds?
I am worried. I'm actually tested a little bit, but let me tell you what's happening. When I first came to Silicon Valley in 1999, this was the place to be. It was paradise. Now, if you are a builder, if you are an entrepreneur, you got to be here. I would even venture out to say that in all over the world, Silicon Valley embodies the values of INSEAD, diversity and innovation and entrepreneurship. So it was a great place to be and a great place to meet other people. But as I saw, now I remember the first deal I did, there was an old school venture capital investor who was the lead investor. He set the terms, and I saw the employment letter given to the CEO. And in that letter, there was a term, legal term, that said, you are not allowed to move your residence, home residence, or the headquarters of the company beyond 25 miles from some zip code that was located in Palo Alto. And if you needed to move, you needed to get board permission. So that's how the old school Silicon Valley worked. They invested in their backyard. They wanted to have close connections with the founders. They wanted to meet them very often as and when they pleased. They wanted to be able to pop into the office and see the management team. That's gone. So when I built my career in venture, the first thing I did was like, that doesn't make sense. You got to meet entrepreneurs where they are. You cannot demand that they move here. You can, but you're not going to be a successful venture capital investor if you maintain that mindset. So I've always invested outside the Silicon Valley. So here's the challenge. There's one thing that always remained, despite all of the changes that I made. The founding team was in one place, in the same room, sitting across each other and debating with each other. They fight, they get back together, they build the product, and that was necessary. What I'm now facing is a situation where founders are located in London, in Tokyo, and in San Francisco. And even after I invest, there's a company called TrustLayer. I invested. They were located in San Francisco. Now the founders have moved to Florida. I have no control. Nobody knows where people are. You have no idea where the four of us are. We could be in Hawaii if you. So I cannot impose that the founders stay in one location. That just doesn't make sense. That really scares me. And I have to learn how to adjust to that new normal.
Fair enough. No, I mean, it is a scary future for all of us, not just investors, to be honest. Sean, you've been keeping an eye on the numbers, right? Of where are people going? I mean, I've even seen, I think we've exchanged mails about the zip codes of where people are going. It looks like actually a number of people are not going that far away, right? They're just going to Marin, or they're going to, this area around San Francisco, and they're preparing a future where they might have to commute back 2 or 3 times a week to the office and work home for the rest of the time. Is that, what's your perspective on that? Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, well, right now that does appear to be the pattern. That I agree with Gioia that it'll be company by company. Nobody knows exactly what the formula is going to be. We've had that debate in our own organization, but in the end, it'll be hybrid to some degree. And are people back in 3 days a week or 4 days a week? But it's pretty clear that we're not going to stay remote forever. To some degree, we'll all be distributed, but people are going to get back together again. And when they do it, they'll be doing it in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. So then the question is, where are they the rest of the time? And what we're seeing in the numbers now is that, yeah, there are some people who are moving to Austin or someplace else in the country, but the vast majority, in fact, are moving maybe an hour to an hour and a half away. They're moving to the counties surrounding the Bay Area, to the north, the east, and the south, where they've been cooped up in apartments in the city, sharing houses, and they can get a bigger house with more space and a yard for the kids to run around in, and it's more affordable. But you can drive in the city, you can get public transit, you can come and go. And some of them have gone to live with their parents, and they're not going to want to stay with their parents forever, I don't think. So right now it does appear that people are looking for more affordable space, more open space, but they're not leaving Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. They're just going someplace where they can afford it better and have more space. And the likelihood is they may move back in the city if rents continue to stay as low as they are now.
That's right. I mean, I noticed that on my bike ride, I've got, there was a house for rent last week. It stayed up for rent 2 days, and then it was rented out. I mean, we're talking Los Altos, which is not too far. So I think there's a demand for houses for rent in the area. But I can tell you from my experience, because I've worked for a BT for 20 years from here, and I had responsibility for part of the R&D team back in the UK. So my office was more often on the on Virgin Atlantic or British Airways. But the time I was here, I noticed how you need to be really, really rigorous with the etiquette of these meetings, where you have half of the people in the office and half of the people dining from home. And in many instances, it wasn't half, it was just me dining from home. And I was kind of the forgotten guy in the meeting. And for me to interject and for my voice to be heard in meetings, it was quite a challenge. So I worry about this future where hybrid isn't well controlled, and people actually have to rush back to have their voices heard. So we'll see how it pans out. But I'd like to move on to, and please guys, don't hesitate to ask any questions in the Q&A or on chat if you have any questions about what we're talking about here. Keep it interactive. So the third bit of our discussion is about the global clusters, and particularly the fact that, again, this is not something that's new. I mean, we've seen Israel and all sorts of places. I mean, in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, a lot of Eastern European countries also have their own clusters. Of course, there's Bangalore, and as we know, with the decoupling of China and the US, what's happening south of the Yangtze River there is also quite interesting in terms of the cluster around Shenzhen. So on that front, Gopi, I'll start with you on this one. What's the importance of geography? Does it even matter? Does a geographic cluster even mean something nowadays?
So Silicon Valley has enjoyed this higher class of innovation, and Silicon Valley is like the epicenter of the future. Now you come to, I remember an MBA graduation speech. The speaker said, "I came to Silicon Valley and I touched the future." So that entitles a lot of people in the Silicon Valley to feel that they are above everybody else. And if you're in the Silicon Valley, you're kind of the leader in innovation. What is happening to other locations is that they've always been like tier 2. You can never be Silicon Valley. But that attitude, I think, is incorrect. The future of Silicon Valley is going to the cloud. Influencers are in the cloud. My podcast is in the cloud. It doesn't have an address in Silicon Valley. That is going to rule the future. So therefore, now what does it mean for Silicon Valley? It means that we need to learn to work with other hubs. These other hubs could be a fintech hub could come out of New York. Maybe a SaaS hub could come out of Bangalore. Or some other type of hub could come out of a different location. And it will become more important for Silicon Valley people to be open-minded and friendly and don't be that jerk that you feel like you're above everybody else. That attitude worked previously. It won't work in the future. So we have to learn to collaborate with other hubs. That's, I think, will help us in the future.
Fair enough. Sean, coming to you on this question, I mean, you've been advising governments about how they should create a Silicon Valley, right? I mean, they come to you, they knock on your door and say, please tell us, how do we create that Silicon Valley in our neck of the woods? So what do you make of it? I mean, is it going to be easier for them now? Is your job of telling them how to do it going to be easier?
Well, I wouldn't tell them how to do it. It wouldn't be quite that bold. But from watching what goes on here, I'd say what Gopi is talking about is already happening. It's been happening for a while, that when we have visitors come, from any countries, and they've wanted to learn what goes on here, what can they take home? There are things that are just hard to replicate. You mentioned earlier kind of the attitude toward risk, which is deeply embedded here. The attitude of thinking big, trying to think transformationally. A lot of places with great technology, great engineers don't quite think that way yet, but they can. So I think there are certain things that kind of define the Valley to a large degree, and certain assets that are very, very concentrated, such as the dense availability of investment capital, especially later stage and growth capital, and experienced people who are mentors and who have founded companies and are investors themselves. So that isn't going away. So I think what I've told people, and this isn't going to change, that this answer is that it's really hard to replicate just by checking off boxes, Silicon Valley. It would take a long time to create it, but on the other hand, you don't have to. We've had hubs all around the world for a long time, and hubs in Israel, hubs in Stockholm, hubs in Berlin, in Paris, in Bangalore, in Shenzhen. This isn't new. I think what people come to Silicon Valley for is, if they're young companies, they're coming for the growth capital, or they're coming to scale globally. And to fill in gaps very often, it's harder to fill at home. Sometimes it's easier to get in the door of a big international company in Silicon Valley than it is if they're across the street from you in your home country, because the doors are very open. So companies have often come here to plug into assets that are harder to find at home and then take that back home. Very often their engineering is still done at home, even if the founders might be here. So yeah, I think it's going to be more distributed, but that's not a bad thing. I think the Valley will continue to play a central hub kind of role for these centers all around the world in a collaborative way. Our VCs are investing more internationally already. I think that's just going to accelerate.
Yeah, fair enough. And Gioia, I mean, you've been very clear about the fact that the diversity of the place is one of its assets. Now, has Silicon Valley lost its luster with the Europeans? I mean, I was going to say you sell it to the Swiss. You don't really sell it, but you promote it. It still works, right?
It absolutely still works. And I actually really love what both Gopi and Sean talked about, because I think ultimately when you think about the internet, the strength of the network comes from the number of nodes. This is how we have to think of innovation. The more nodes we have in the world, the more hubs where innovation is created, is fostered, where ideas come to life every single day, the stronger we will be as a world to actually tackle the biggest problems we face as a humanity. So I think this is absolutely a positive thing. And in the case and by the way, these cities should not be in competition, they should be in communication. And this is really what swissnex is all about ultimately. Switzerland established this very weird thing called the swissnex network 20 years ago, when no such thing existed. And it developed so-called innovation diplomacy or science diplomacy. And the idea was that we understood in Switzerland that unless we connect with the rest of the world, we will not remain at the forefront of innovation or economic growth, or ultimately the well-being of our citizens. And today we have offices around the world. We're not just in the Silicon Valley. Yes, we were the second. Boston was first, thank you, in San Francisco. Today we have offices in India, China, Brazil. We're soon opening in Japan. So this is what innovation should be. And it is absolutely important that we explore more the relationships between those nodes, and that we actually understand also every node needs to understand where it's very specific comparative advantage towards peers. And Silicon Valley has one that is unparalleled, as Sean also mentioned. I think there is the spirit. I think that's something that cannot be, it's hard to replicate because it's so deep in the history of this place, the pioneering spirit of this ultimate Western frontier that lies literally in the air, like we can all breathe it. And I think that is something that you will not find in the Swiss mountains ever. But bringing those two worlds together is where the magic happens. And I think that's what we are all about. And I think that's how we should look at these developments, as a very positive thing, actually.
So true. Yes. And Soto was a Swiss guy, right? I mean, who went for gold in the, Wild West. So, I mean, that spirit is still alive and important. And, I must tell you, I told you a minute ago that it's very disturbing when you're the only voice at the end of the phone when everyone else is speaking in the room. But one way I had to get my voice heard was to start my sentences by, well, in Silicon Valley, let me tell you how it's done, ... And then all of a sudden I got silence and people would listen. So hopefully that will continue. So we're going to go on to our fourth and last part, which is the spirit of Silicon Valley. And as we do that, Kamal's been asking a question that's a leading question into this last point. And his question is, how important has immigration been to Silicon Valley as an innovation hub? And of course, I mean, I think we all know the answer to that. Who'd like to, pick up the ball on that question from Kamal? Importance of immigration.
Sorry, who did the question go to?
Immigration. So how important has it been to Silicon Valley as an innovation hub?
So who is that question
go
to?
Gioia, go ahead.
Go ahead. Anyone is, I mean, you all have an opinion. Gioia, why don't you start?
I'm an immigrant, so yes, I have an opinion. No, but I mean, the other question, I mean, when you look at this history of Silicon Valley, immigration was not just a concept of foreign nationals coming in, but people coming from the East Coast to the West Coast, ultimately to seek fortune, whatever fortune is. It doesn't have to be just a monetary thing, but seeking that, you know, next frontier and trying to build a new life or a new future. And I think that is absolutely key to the Bay Area. It is key to, frankly, the one thing that we immigrants have in common is that we sought that thing, right? Like we came here for something. And I recently just read that quote of the editor-in-chief for technology, actually from the Chronicle, the technology editor, just left, and he wrote in his sort of, it's almost like a love letter to San Francisco, and he said, in San Francisco, there's a sense that there's always something beyond the horizon waiting to be discovered, and that is what attracts the immigrants to this place. And I think it is also this push of, you're in a place that is not yours, you're in a place where you only have upside. I mean, there's lots of downsides, right? You can fail, but you know, the upside can be so big because the terrain is so wide open. And I think that is key to the moonshot mindset that we find in the Bay Area, that I can tell you does not exist in Switzerland, which is why we bring our entrepreneurs over here to expose them to that kind of mindset. And that's also why, you know, it's maybe not San Francisco, but why we're thinking about Mars, that on the West Coast here, you know, as the next frontier. This kind of thinking, I think, is what has attracted the immigrants, and the immigrants have built this place, whether they are foreign nationals or not. And, you know, Swiss Sutter, right? General Sutter was one of them, a crazy guy who really sort of laid much of the foundation of what we see today in the Bay Area with the gold rush, etc.
Fair enough, fair enough. So, Gopi, perhaps your perspective on this idea of the spirit of Silicon Valley. You alluded to it already. I mean, Silicon Valley's got to be in the cloud. It's the Silicon Valley spirit that matters more than the geography itself. But still, I mean, you know, the playbook that we've been writing together, or that we've been actually playing out together, the, you know, playbook of Agile and Lean and MVP and all these good innovation practices that have been leading the world. Do you think that playbook could be written by someone else in the future? I mean, the diaspora that we talked about, is it going to dilute, or is it going to stay here?
That playbook could be written by anyone, but the mindset, the spirit of Silicon Valley is that, I'm going to quote Dominique Trempont. Dominique Trempont is one of our alums, an illustrious alum. He was the CFO to Steve Jobs, and he used to teach the Building Business Silicon Valley class before I took over. He says that Silicon Valley is the spiritual capital of the world. London, I don't know what London's capital of, rainy days and warm beer maybe, or New York is the financial capital of the world, and maybe Switzerland, pick a city, Geneva may be the political capital of the world, and there are a few cultural capitals of the world and sports capitals of the world, maybe pick a city in Brazil, Argentina, or some other part of the world. What it means to be spiritual capital of the world is that new ideas face least resistance. That's how he described it. And I truly believe that. And that is the mindset that whoever writes that playbook will need to have.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, Sean, I'd like to ask you a question before we go to open to wider Q&A. And guys, please continue pouring your questions in the Q&A. But Sean, you know a lot about the ingredients. I mean, we talked about some of these ingredients already of Silicon Valley, but why do you think Silicon Valley has been so resilient in the past? What are these ingredients that have made the resilience of Silicon Valley? Could be the ingredients for the rebirth once more.
Well, one is certainly the attitude that Gioia and Gopi were just talking about. And by the way, the attraction to immigrants. There are more immigrant founders here than any place else in the US. It's maybe 25% of tech companies nationally are founded by immigrants. Here it's closer to 50%. They come from everywhere, Greater China, from India, across Europe, from Mexico. I talk to these people all the time, and they literally come from everywhere. So we would not be what we are without the kind of creative immigration that continually flows through here. And those people bring that value back to their home countries, back to their home cities. So it is a circular process that enriches everybody at the end. But the immigration is so important to our creativity and our diversity and just how this place operates. You walk on a campus, sometimes you don't know what country you're in because people are from everywhere. So as long as we can keep that, that's really, really important. I'm pretty confident in the next 4 years under the new administration that immigration door is going to widen again. But the fundamental ingredients haven't changed. You've got great universities, you've got Stanford, you've got Berkeley, just a phenomenal production of Nobel laureates, even last year, just continuing to spew out Nobel laureates. But you also have University of California, Davis, the leading agricultural technology university in the US. You've got UC Santa Cruz, very, very strong programs as well. You've got UC San Francisco, one of the top 2 biomedical campuses in the United States. So they're all churning out technology that ends up being licensed very often and commercialized. They're churning out founders. Most of the companies, tech companies here, if it wasn't an immigrant, they've been founded by people from one of these universities who've located their company within a stone's throw of the campus they came off of. So that's not going to change. The concentration of venture capital here isn't changing. The density of it isn't changing. Nearly 50% of the venture capital invested in the US is Silicon Valley capital, but it's going to be more distributed. I think it is going to find other places around the US to find opportunity and startups, and that's a good thing. There's no reason it all has to be spent here. It's good for the US to have it spread around more broadly. But I think the big companies here, 4 out of the 10 most highly capitalized companies in the world are Bay Area companies. That isn't going to change anytime soon. And they're engines of innovation. They acquire companies, they support startups, they have their own corporate venture funds. So you put it all together, and you put it together with the attitude we've been talking about of risk-taking and really wanting to break molds and look to the future that goes back to the gold rush. I think things will be more distributed, but I think the fundamentals really haven't changed and aren't likely to change anytime soon.
No, I like all that, and I think what I've been saying is every time, and Gioia will probably resonate with that, every time we have visitors here, we teach them Innovation 101 from Silicon Valley. I would like to move to the second chapter of the book, right? I mean, we'd like to be able to teach them some more advanced lessons. And once they've all, once everyone on the planet, all these hubs that we've talked about, reach a certain level of maturity, we'll be able to get to the next level. And whether they write part of the playbook or we do, doesn't really matter. We all collectively want that. So let's move on to Q&A before we close. And we've got a couple of questions. One I'd like to ask, perhaps Gopi, for you, a question from Samir. Because you've been talking about the hubs and how these hubs could complement each other. Samir is asking, can you share any illustrative examples of what you've seen yourself, how these hubs could work together, these innovation hubs on the planet?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is something that I speak about very openly. McKinsey and Bain bring me into their meetings with their clients when they visit Silicon Valley, and they ask this question about how can they tap Silicon Valley. And I try to tell them the opposite, that I'm trying to tap you. And the reason why it's important is that I had this conversation with one of my founders, and I asked them, like, what are some ways that investors have added value, including me? The first step is that if it's a Silicon Valley investor, the Silicon Valley investor solves Silicon Valley problems, founder disputes, how to grow, growth hacking, those various different types of things. And they're really good at that. But now the game has changed. Investors need to be able to solve real world problems, which means that when companies start selling software beyond Silicon Valley to mainstream companies in the Midwest or outside the US, those are real companies with real employees, with real products. They don't walk and talk like Silicon Valley. How do you bridge that? And helping those founders requires a mindset for the investor who understands those businesses. So that's the driver for people in the Silicon Valley to go out and reach out to these hubs and build those bridges. I can't do everything from here. I need friends in other parts of the world.
Fair enough. We'll take one more and last question, and then I'll ask you guys to conclude with a couple of sentences each. But the last question, from Christian about Zoom fatigue and about how the tools that we have all experimented with and we've become very, very good at over the last year, how are they going to change? So Kristen's talking about, for instance, Clubhouse. Are we going to move away from the 100% screen time during the day? I would add to this, what about more immersive tech? What about virtual reality or augmented reality glasses? Do you anticipate, do you guys have any perspectives on that? Perhaps, you, Gopi, perhaps you, Gioia?
Go ahead, Gioia.
I can take a step, sorry. Yeah, I mean, swissnex organizes a lot of events. That's one of our key, I would say, things that we're known for in the Bay Area in terms of how we build community and organize exhibitions at the intersection of art and technology, et cetera. So, the immersive technologies have always been an important topic for us, exploring those and figuring out how we can, our audiences into these worlds where somehow the creativity and the technology collide. Now, in terms of what's, Clubhouse, I think is an interesting format in the sense that it is a bit of a break for the mind. I think there are major privacy concerns to be watchful of. So I don't know how much, at what point people will start thinking about the implications of that. Right now, it's a very hot tool. And just seeing how in the last 3-4 weeks it has taken off and everybody's organizing their Clubhouse events, I think is quite interesting to see. And it's definitely something we will play around with as well, because it allows you to reach different audiences. In terms of other immersive technologies, it's something we're looking at as well. We are actually planning on building a digital experience lab at Pier 17, where we think about how we can create those hybrid experiences in a more meaningful and more immersive way than that sort of, square, two-dimensional screen experience that we have today, so that we can actually, it brings me sort of to the last point, that the question of Adam that he is also bringing up, questions around climate change, et cetera. I think that kind of can very much tie into this, because as several of us, I know that Sean is the same, I think for INSEAD it's the same, we're all shipping people around the globe to experience Silicon Valley. And I think one question we all need to ask ourselves is, how can we do our work without relying on literally moving people, and many people halfway around the globe? So what are ways to create those connections between those hubs through immersive technologies? And I think we'll see a lot of developments in that space in the coming months. I have been a little bit surprised at how little has come out just in the period of this pandemic, but I'm sure there's so many creative people working on that right now, and that stuff will come soon, from holographic technology, VR, AR, etc.
Fantastic. So look, I mean, we've got maybe 3 or 4 minutes left, and I'd like to give you a chance to give a final, concluding remark for each of our panelists here. And I think you've all noticed that we are Silicon Valley fanboys and fangirls here, and we firmly believe that Silicon Valley is going to regenerate itself once more. Why don't you guys give us your final thoughts on this? We'll start with Gioia first, and then Gopi and Sean.
Yes, I actually want to go back to Adam's question. I think Silicon Valley, well, let's see, San Francisco has been a force of counterculture, a very important one in the past, and has stood for values of humanity, let's say, and our Western societies, and that has really moved us forward progressively. And I think a little bit of that spirit got lost in the last 2 decades, maybe. And I am very hopeful that this pandemic will reverse that tide a little bit again, where we understand that technology plays an absolutely crucial, one of the central roles in helping us address humanity's biggest challenges. And I have felt truly in my conversations with people in the Silicon Valley over the past 12 months that something has shifted. The last straw was the blackouts in whatever, September, I believe it was, and seeing how so many people somatically felt like something needs to change. And I think that's something where we'll see beautiful things emerging and coming from this part of the world. And I'm excited to be a part of that as well.
Thank you, Gioia. Gopi, concluding words.
Now, I watch my classmates on a WhatsApp group, and I stay in touch with many of them. What I see as a common thread among all my classmates, I graduated in 2007 from INSEAD, so we're more than 10 years away from that day. I see analysis paralysis. I see people stuck in the world of advisory work, and they're torturing themselves. My 2 cents to anyone watching this is just get out of that torture, build things, get into a role where you can make decisions, use business as a force for good. And when you're ready to start a company, call me for funding.
Fantastic. Enthusing. Sean, final words.
I would say that Silicon Valley has always reinvented itself again and again and again. It's very different today than it was 15 years ago, and that's different than it was before that. So I think we're about to go into another turn. And I think what people are asking themselves is, when we all come back to something, it won't be the same thing. And we shouldn't want it to be the same thing. We should try to come back to something that's better and to make it better. So I think while the future will be more distributed, both domestically around the US to other places, Miami, Atlanta, wherever, and internationally, a place still matters. And I think for the foreseeable future, Silicon Valley will still be that place that's really the premier global marketplace of ideas.
Fantastic. Well, we've covered a lot of points on this rich subject. So please join me in thanking again Gioia, Sean, and Gopi for an excellent discussion. And we're handing over back to you, Isabel.